Lesson 5, Section 2. This presentation will be turning once again to verbs. We'll be looking at the infinitive, tense, the future tense in Greek, and some sound changes in the future tense. And we'll be talking about meter in both English and Greek. In both English and Greek, one may distinguish between finite verb forms and infinitives. We'll talk more about what each of these means. Finite verb forms show changes in person and number. These are your garden variety verb forms. For example, she knows what I know. She knows, third person singular, to agree with the she. And know, I know, first person singular form of the verb, to agree with the I. Infinitives, on the other hand, do not show such changes. She wants to know what I want to know. Whether she is the one wanting to do the knowing, or I am the one wanting to do the knowing, it's just know. This is also called the to infinitive, where you have the preposition to in front of the infinitive. Another example, it is necessary for her to know. So regardless of who is wanting to do the knowing or for whom it is necessary that something is known, we have the infinitive in the same form in English. Infinitives do show changes in tense and voice. For instance, we could say, it is necessary for her to be known, would be a passive voice infinitive, or it is necessary for her to have been known, would be a past tense, passive infinitive, whatever you might call that in English. And actually, the Greek infinitive is similar in a lot of these ways to the English one. We start with the present active infinitive in Greek, of course. Present tense, that is, like to know. Active voice, as in to know, as opposed to be known, and the infinitive. To form the present active infinitive in Greek, simply add ein to the stem of the verb. Let's look at a verb like akouo, I hear, I listen. To get the stem, of course, we just drop the omega, we get the akou, and we add ein to it and accentuate it properly to get our present active infinitive, akouein. In English, we would translate this just in the abstract as something like to hear or to listen to. As in English, the Greek infinitive is used with certain verbs. For instance, etela or tela, I am willing or I wish. Just as in English, we don't usually use the infinitive just on its own. It's usually with something in a certain special kind of construction. So it's really important in Greek when we see an infinitive form to ask ourselves, why? Let's look at akouein etela ton lagansu. So here we have the infinitive akouein, to hear, to listen, along with a form of the verb etela, I am willing or wish. So a good translation of this would be, I am willing to hear your speech. The I am willing maps onto the etela. To hear is our translation of the infinitive akouein, and your speech is an idiomatic translation of ton lagansu, which literally might be something like the speech of you. That su is that genitive singular form of the pronoun su, you. The infinitive is also used in other kinds of constructions. For instance, with the word kre, it is necessary. Akouein kre, we might translate this as, it is necessary to listen or to hear. And depending on the context, this could mean you have to hear, or I have to hear or listen. This is a construction that is often highly contextual. Either way, kre takes that infinitive, akouein. Let's turn to tense. In both English and Greek, a verb changes its form as its tense changes. A verb's tense shows the temporal relation between the action it describes and the present moment. For instance, I am a doctor. This is a present tense form of the verb to be, and it's showing that the relation between the action it describes, the being, and the present moment is basically coincident in time, present in time. However, if this action, the being, was in the past, we say, I was a doctor. I shall be a doctor would be the future tense form of that. While English and Greek share most tenses, they sometimes use them differently. Also, there are different names for the tenses between the two languages sometimes, depending on who's calling them what. So these are the basic list of all of the tenses in both English and Greek. You may not be familiar with all of these terms, even for the tenses in English: past perfect, simple past, past progressive, present, present perfect, future, future perfect. In reality, there are lots of different names that each of these tenses could be called. And there are some differences between the terminology I'm going to use for English tenses and the terminology I'm going to use for Greek tenses. This is to try to make use of the terminology we find in our grammar book, as well as the usual terminology to describe things in English. Now, we have looked already at the present tense. We've covered that. We're going to look today at the future tense. Fortunately, the present tense is called the same thing in English and Greek, and so is the future. How to form the future tense in Greek depends on the nature of the verb. This isn't actually as hard as it sounds. For most verbs, simply add sigma and the present tense endings to the stem. Take your stem, add sigma, and add the endings we've already learned. For instance, pa'al, I stop, I close, etc. To get our stem, drop the omega, we get pau. We add the sigma for the future tense, and we add our usual present tense ending. Accentuate it, pau sol would be no longer I stop, but I shall stop. Simple as that. Pau ses would be you shall stop, or you will stop. Pau se would be he, she, or it will stop. For verbs whose stems end in a consonant, however, pau, its stem pau ends in a diphthong, not a consonant. Adding sigma to the stem results in a sound change. This happens in English, it happens in every language. If something is difficult to pronounce with the letters you would expect, then a sound change results. For instance, let's look at a verb like lega. To get our stem, we drop the omega, we get leg. But when we add the sigma, we get legs, which is kind of harder to pronounce. So that gamma sigma actually changes to oxai, lex. Lex-a would be I shall say. I shall say. There's another form of this, the future tense of this particular verb. Lexa is just a good example, though, of a verb whose stem ends in a consonant and the change that results in the future tense. So I don't expect you to remember these, of course, but these are the changes that we see. If your stem ends in a labial, that is having to do with sounds made with the lips, beta, pi, phi, pi, tau, and you add a sigma to it, you get psi. If your stem ends in a guttural, like gamma, kappa, chi, double tau, and you add a sigma, you get a xi. Like we just saw, we saw a verb whose stem ended in gamma. Guttural is made with throat. Dental is made with the teeth. Delta, tau, theta, zeta, plus sigma equals sigma, actually. So that dental disappears, and we're just left with a sigma. This is, as we will see, this list of changes is actually applicable in other cases as well, so it's a handy chart. There is not, unfortunately, a version of this, I don't think, in our grammar book. Let's turn to something completely different. Meter in English. A poem's meter is its rhythmical pattern. We're going to talk about meter in English in order to be able to make sense of meter in Greek. In English, metrical poetry tends to be of two kinds. Historically, of course, virtually all English poetry was metrical in nature. It had a definite rhythmical pattern, starting in the 19th century with poets like Walt Whitman, for instance. We started to see what is sometimes called free verse, where there is no clear, recurrent rhythmical pattern. But traditionally speaking, most English poetry was metrical. And there are two kinds. Accentual, which has to do with accents. It's based on the number of accents in a line. Stresses is another name for accents. An example would be W.B. Yeats's The Lake Isle of Innisfree. W. Yeats is an Irish poet. He was a Nobel laureate, a great late 19th, 20th century poet.
I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 19 rows.
Anyway, that's his voice, actually. A very early recording of an English poet. And what I've done here with these red marks here is indicate the accents or the stresses. I'm going to exaggerate this for pedagogical purposes. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. You'll count 6 stresses in each line. This is an accentual meter. There is an irregular number of other stuff. I'll talk about that in a second. So you might call this, well, it's hexameter of a kind. Accentual hexameter is probably the best term for it. You can go and listen to the full reading of Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree just about anywhere. YouTube would be a good place to start. So the other way to structure your meter in English is accentual syllabic. This is based on the number of accents and of syllables. An example would be Poe's The Raven. And I'm going to exaggerate the meter here, once again for pedagogical purposes. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. If I were to mark the accents here, we would see these once upon a midnight dreary, etc. But we also see a regular alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables. And in fact, there are an equal number of unstressed syllables as stressed ones, which leads to an equal number, a regular number of syllables. So we have both a regular number of accents and a regular number of syllables. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. Obviously, that's not a very good reading of this, but it gets the point across. Accentual syllabic meters are described with reference to 2 things. So how do we describe a meter like this? I gave you an example before, accentual hexameter. We'll talk about what that means. First of all, we have the pattern of feet. Feet are groups, really, of stressed and unstressed syllables in English. Usually a stressed syllable followed by a certain number of unstressed syllables. There is the unstressed stressed pattern, which would be called iambic, Greek term, and the stressed unstressed, so just the opposite. This would be called trochaic, another Greek term. And there are many other kinds of feet in English and other languages' meters. We also describe accentual syllabic meters with reference to the number of feet in each line. So how many of these little groups, these combinations, do we see? If we see 3, we call it trimeter. If we see 4, we call it tetrameter. If we see 5, we call it pentameter, etc. So a line like this, if we were to analyze the pattern of its feet, we would call trochaic. We have a series of stressed syllables followed by the same number of unstressed syllables. And we have 8 of these, so we would call it trochaic octameter. Trochaic octameter, a very, very uncommon meter, actually. This is how we would describe this meter for ease of reference. Now, meter in Greek. As in English, meter in Greek is described in terms of 1, the pattern of feet, and 2, the number of feet in each line. So same way to analyze Greek meter and describe it. Unlike in English, feet are not patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables, but of long and short ones. This is actually very different. An example, Homer's Odyssey. I have another clip for you here. Let's listen to it.
Andramoyen epemus apolitropon hos malapolla.
That too is exaggerated a little bit to bring out the rhythm. But this is how we would analyze it. We have long syllables marked by the horizontal line and short ones marked by the little U's. So I'll try to do the same thing. Andramoi enepemusa palutrapanhas malapala. So you will hear in Greek, there are accents, of course, there are accented syllables, but they don't really have anything to do with the meter. The meter is constructed by alternations of long and short syllables. Because of this focus on syllable length, Greek meter is called quantitative in nature. English meter is usually called qualitative in nature. It has to do with the difference of the quality between stressed and unstressed syllables. Greek is more mathematical in some ways. It makes use of this distinction between long and short syllables. Now, some rules. Syllables can be long by nature or by position. By nature is obviously the easier one. Ones long by nature would be syllables with long vowels. All of these are examples of long vowels. We're familiar with these. Syllables with diphthongs. Any diphthong is usually considered long by nature. We also have length by position, syllables that are long by their position, that is, relatively speaking. Syllables with short vowels followed by two or more consonants. For instance, andra. That first alpha is actually short. It's not a long alpha, but it's followed by two or more consonants, in this case 3, nu, delta, rho. So alpha actually counts as long by position. And we saw that analyzed as long in the previous verse that we saw from Homer. Zeta, psi, and psi are double consonants, so they actually count as 2. So if you have a short vowel before one of them, it counts as long by position. There are some exceptions. These are details you don't have to memorize, but good to know that they're out there. If we have a mute, which is any of these 9 consonants, followed by a liquid, which is any of these 4 consonants, it could actually go either way. It could be long or short. That is, that short vowel followed by a mute or liquid would be long or short. These are very detailed rules. As you realize, it's just helpful to know they're out there. The basic ones are whether something is long by nature or whether it's followed by 2 consonants or more. Iambic trimeter. This is a very common meter in Greek tragedy and comedy, maybe the most common meter. It's iambic trimeter. All the dialogue, for instance, in Oedipus Rex is going to be in iambic trimeter. All the dialogue in Aristophanes' plays, the comedies of Aristophanes, is also going to be in iambic trimeter. As its name suggests, the basic pattern of feet in iambic trimeter is iambic, that is, short, long, da 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 da. However, trimeter is misleading. A line of iambic trimeter actually consists of the equivalent of 6 iambs, not 3, as its name would suggest, grouped together into 3 metra, which are like groups of iambs. This is sort of what it looks like. We have 3 groups of these iambs and 2 iambs in each group. Kakon peru sikar panhoi kakoi pilloi would be again a kind of mechanical reading of this. If you follow along, you can hear the difference between the shorts and the longs, and you can also, I'm trying to maintain the accents as well. Kakon peru sikar panhoi kakoi pilloi. That would be one way to read this. There are some nuances to iambic trimeter, and we're going to be seeing some iambic trimeter in this lesson, the readings for this lesson, so it'll be helpful to know these. The first syllable of each metron, there are 3 metra, if you remember, in a line of iambic trimeter. The first syllable can be short or long. This is represented visually with an X, which is also called an anceps, which is a Latin word for think it's something like two-headed or something like that. It can be either short or long. Also, two short syllables can be substituted for a long one. This is called resolution. If the meter calls for a long syllable, you can actually stick two short ones in its place. This doesn't happen very often in tragedy. It's more common in comedy. The last syllable of the line is always considered long for metrical purposes. So it's always considered long, whether in reality it's short or long. Greek iambic trimeter, then, can be visualized in the following way. We have 3 metra. Those vertical lines divide them up. And we have the X as the first in each of these metra. And it basically tells you that that syllable could be long or short. And then we have the horizontal line, which indicates that we need a long there. And then the U, which indicates that we need a short there. And again, that last syllable actually should probably have an X there, because it could be short or long. But this is the basic pattern we see for iambic trimeter. And again, it's most formulaic. It sounds something like ba-da, 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 ba-da. For the forms of the future tense of verbs in omega, you can look at page 62 in the grammar. And for further reading on the tenses, you can look at pages 60 to 61. Thank you very much.